On this Thursday, we have Mr. Gilstrap still in studio. He never really leaves. And Mr. John Doyle. He breezes in once a week.
I do.
Good to see you again, sir.
And good to be here.
We have come to that point in the scheduling format where Mr. John Gilstrap, who is a New York Times best-selling author, only hangs out with other New York Times best-selling authors. And as a result, he has expanded our
He's
guest
an
pool.
elitist.
It's like pretty
I hang
girls.
with you, Doyle. Clearly,
I could just say that Mr. Gilstrap, a former Teamster, I might add as well.
that's right. The screenwriting union is we're Teamsters.
And just to kind of stay in shape for that, he was out busting skulls earlier this morning and lending money to build casinos in Las Vegas.
That's right, with my quill.
So, John, this is when you introduce the guests that you are kind enough to set us up with across the publishing world.
Yeah, and it turns out that this is a fortuitous day. It was 1859, I believe.
It was.
That John Brown's raid. We have with us today Eugene L. Meyer, Gene, who wrote a book called Five for Freedom, The African-American Soldiers in John Brown's Army. He's been on the show at least once before. And welcome, Gene, to the show. How are you?
Great, good to be here.
Good. Let's start with tell us refresh our memories on the importance of John Brown's raid.
Sure. First of all, let me mention that October 16th, 1859, 166 years today, was when the raid began. It was
Hey, Gene,
a rainy Sunday.
Excuse me, can you go off speaker? The sound's not great.
Off speaker, okay. I'm not talking in my ears. Let me change it here. Okay, how's this?
Oh, way better. Thank you.
Much better, yes.
Okay, well, let's begin again. October 16th, 1859, it was a rainy Sunday when John Brown and 18 of his small army walked 5 miles down a country road from a farm in Maryland to the ferry, where they seized the town and the federal arsenal and rifle works there. And Brown was seeking to incite a slave insurrection that he was convinced would, lead to guerrilla warfare from the nearby mountains and topple the institution of slavery. Of course, it did not turn out the way he planned, but it had a major impact on American history and is often cited as the spark for the Civil War that began about a year and a half later. So that's where we are. That's where we were. Country was already deeply polarized, especially following the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831 in Southampton, Virginia, in which the self-proclaimed prophet led a group of free and enslaved African Americans who were involved in the murder of some 55 whites, and there was a backlash to that, and some 200 blacks were killed in response. And the South had been, on a knife's edge ever since then, and passed many restrictions, even on free people of color. So the stage was set for this attempted insurrection in October 1859. The country was very polarized. Many of the southern states had already drafted their articles of secession. Interestingly, only one, Texas, mentioned states' rights. It was all about slavery. And the raid did not succeed. It lasted about maybe 36 hours. And Colonel Robert E. Lee was dispatched from his home in Virginia and led 90 Marines. And then about a day or two later, they stormed what became known as the John Brown's Fort. It was actually the Arsenal Fire Engine House where Brown and some of his group had retreated to. And that was the end of the rebellion. There were 10 who were killed. There was one of the Marines in the crossfire, but Brown survived. 2 of his sons didn't. They were shot during the Marine takeover, and Brown and others who were captured were subsequently indicted by the Charlestown grand jury. They were tried and they were convicted. All the jurors were slave owners, and they became a martyr for the cause. They were Governor Henry Wise of Virginia received tons of mail from both sides, people asking for Brown to be pardoned or a sentence commuted, and of course just the opposite. And some curiosity seekers who hope to get a piece of John Brown's hair or scalp, whatever, or one of the pikes. They had 1,000 pikes that had amassed at this little farm in nearby Maryland, with financed by what they're known as the Secret Six. They were half a dozen patrician New Englanders who helped finance his unsuccessful raid. So that's it in a nutshell. And it's just the country was already polarized, and the John Brown raid just really heightened that polarity, and led a few months later to the shot heard around the world. I'm talking about the firing on Fort Sumter, South Carolina, that began really the bloody Civil War, which 750,000 people, both sides.
Which side was most energized by the raid? Was it the South that realized that there was a rebellion trying to be organized, or was it the North that realized that there's hope for abolition?
I think it was the South. When the raid occurred, it wasn't just the Marines who showed up. It was militias from Jefferson County, but also from as far away as Richmond. And they felt that the abolitionists had crossed the Rubicon. And I think there was tremendous paranoia and fear in the South over what was to come to the institution of slavery. Remember, Virginia had the largest population of enslaved people of any of the southern states. In the North, there was abolitionist sentiment, but as you recall, when the war began, Lincoln made it all about saving the Union. So there were strong feelings on both sides, but I think the South was more energized by John Brown's raid.
Yeah, and this is John Doyle. The abolitionist sentiment in the North was not nearly as widespread as the pro-slavery sentiment in the South at the time. Although there might have been as many people, because even at the time, the states that stayed in the Union, collective population was about twice that of the states that seceded. I think I'm correct about that. Let me ask you this. Was the Secret Six, was William Lloyd Garrison one of those, or do they know who all the Secret Six were?
The Secret Six are no longer secret.
Okay.
I believe that Garrison may have been one of the six. I was going to also mention that the reason maybe the South was more energized, at least the white Southerners, was that it basically was a war over economics. And Southerners, at least many, not all, because they were kind of white working class, small farmers who didn't own any slaves, but there was a tremendous investment. And if you would measure, the wealth of the South, the human chattel would have been a huge part of it. So they were very alarmed about losing their investments. So that probably gave them a stronger motivation than the folks up north.
So Eugene L. Meyer is the guest. He wrote a Five for Freedom, the African American soldiers in John Brown's army. Now, these 5 African American soldiers were already free slaves, correct?
Actually, one of them had been enslaved, but the others were free people of color. 2 had come from Oberlin, although their roots were originally in North Carolina. Osborne Perry Anderson, who was the sole survivor and wrote the only insider account of the raid, was from southeastern Pennsylvania, and his father was from Rappahannock County in Virginia. Shields Green was the only one who was believed to have been a slave. There's some controversy about some recent scholarship that suggests that he was not, but we don't really know that. And so who am I leaving out? Osborne Anderson, 2 from Oberlin, Shields Green, and Dangerfield Newby. Very interesting part of the story. He was born enslaved in Virginia, and he had a white father, and his mother was an enslaved woman, and his father and his mother had 11 children, and at one point his father was a slaveholder, decided he wanted to free everybody. And he needed sufferance first from the owner of Newby's mother, and who gave it. And then he moved everybody to West Virginia, actually to Ohio, right across the river from Wheeling. And so Dangerfield was a blacksmith, and he had a wife who was enslaved in Brentsville in Virginia, and they had children. And her owner was about to sell them south, which is the worst thing that could happen if you were enslaved. Much harsher times in the cotton plantations of Louisiana. So he joined John Brown to help free his enslaved wife and their children. And tragically, he was killed on the second day of the raid. Not only killed, but mutilated, first by the townspeople and then by the hogs. So that, and his wife and children were sold south. Eventually, they wound up in a contraband camp, and she remarried and moved back to the Mount Vernon area in Virginia, had 3 more children, and she died in 1884. And interestingly, a teacher in Fairfax County, Virginia, got hold of my book, and she used it as a resource in a 4th grade class. Then Governor Northam had a contest for Black History Month for schools to nominate little-known or forgotten African-American Virginians, and her class nominated Dangerfield and Harriet Newby, as a result of which there is now a state highway memorial plaque in northwestern Culpeper County to both. And that was a very satisfying consequence of the work I did.
And I would tell you, as a person who's done many interviews with Rick Garland from the tours in Harper's Ferry on this program, that Dangerfield Newby is said to haunt Harper's Ferry even to this day, Gene. So if you ever decide to visit Harper's Ferry, take the tour at night with Rick Garland, and there are some interesting stories there. Well,
there are indeed, and some stories that, I hope are new to readers of Five for Freedom, because, the Harper's Ferry is a beautiful place, and it's ironic. It's the confluence of the Potomac and the Shenandoah rivers. You climb up on the hill overlooking it all, and you're there at what the Jefferson Rock, Thomas Jefferson wrote in his book about Virginia, that it was worth a voyage across the Atlantic. So there are many stories in Harper's Ferry, and Dangerfield Newby stories, I think one of the most dramatic and one of the saddest.
Can you tell us about John Brown? What would motivate a person to lead a fight against his country on a cause which had divided the nation?
Well, John Brown came from a religious background. He was originally from Connecticut, and his father was also involved in kind of the Enlightenment movement. I'm not sure what it's called. I'm not a theologian, but in the early part of the 19th century. And his father actually been a trustee and a founding of Oberlin College. And Oberlin was kind of a center of progressive anti-slavery thought. So John Brown came by his convictions honestly. And interestingly, many of the abolitionists, they want to abolish slavery, but they had a rather patrician, almost condescending view towards black people. And John Brown did not. He really treated everybody alike. And that came through particularly in the weeks before the raid, when they were all assembling at this farm in Washington County, Maryland. And there's a lot of information in my book about their exchanges. And he really, fervently believed in the cause. And he, of course, prior to Harper's Ferry, he'd been out in Kansas, what was known as Bleeding Kansas, when there was a proposal to allow popular sovereignty. Whoever got the most votes would decide whether it was a free or a slave state. And that kind of almost civil war in miniature had occurred a couple years earlier, and he'd been out there. In fact, he'd been involved in some pretty violent encounters with slave owners. And he got the name Osawatomie Brown because in at least one there had been murders of slave owners. He was very passionate, but he was also he truly believed in his cause, and he had followers, and the people came to join his little band for different reasons, but his reason was was crystal clear. There was no ambiguity with him.
There's a post in our Facebook page from one of our viewers, Doreen, who says, John Brown seems to be portrayed as a criminal, thereby a bad person. Actually, he is more likely to have been a highly moral man who unfortunately became frustrated with the legal status quo regarding slavery and picked an illegal way to bring about change. And that is true about Brown. He's almost puritanical and was quite frustrated by the peaceful ways they'd hoped to bring about the end of slavery, and decided that really what was needed was action. And this was his action, I guess.
Yeah, Gene Meyer mentioned a movement that was going on at the time, and he used the term enlightenment, and he said he didn't think that was it. I'm trying to think of the name. I can't think of it either, but it was like a moral and religious revival that was sweeping the country, at least the northern half of the country at the time. And I think Brown and his father were part of that. And it seems to me that what we have with John Brown is something that a guy named Eric Hoffer, who was a longshoreman and also a professor of sociology out on the West Coast, wrote a book called The True Believer. And he explained how people get to this point where they are so convinced of the rightness of their cause that they are willing to attempt any means at all, even violent means, to attain those ends.
Gene?
Well, yes. I mean, I think he was very frustrated by the U.S. Congress and of course, President Buchanan was a Pennsylvanian, but he was really a sympathizer with the Southern point of view, and Brown had this fantastical notion that he could somehow bring it all down. And he had in Chatham, Ontario, in 1858, he had a provisional constitution adopted that provided for lots of things that the U.S. Constitution did not, including the sanctity of the marriage relation, and that was a key motivation for Dangerfield Newby, whose marriage to Harriet was not recognized legally. And he was just, frustrated. I mean, he made some really bad tactical mistakes. His raid, his hope for insurrection wouldn't come about, and he kind of stalled. I think, he had opportunities to leave and escape, and he kept delaying, and then there was a eastbound train that came through in Harper's Ferry, and it stopped. And he allowed his prisoners in the John Brown's fort to go out and visit people, and then then word got to Monocacy Junction that this was going on because he delayed, and so that allowed time for the U.S. Marines to arrive and his. But it's interesting, and it's ironic that he may have had a greater impact in death than he did in life, because, as I've said at the beginning, many historians believe that the raid was the spark that led to the Civil War. And as polarized as the country had been before, his death, he was a martyr to some, a villain to others, but it really energized both sides, I think, and led to the inevitable conflict.
Is it clear whether he thought that he would be joined? In my head, this is sort of a Les Mis moment, right, where they start and expect people to join around him in this great rebellion. Was it his anticipation that it would be slaves in rebellion against their masters, or was it his anticipation that it would be abolitionists rising with him to end slavery?
No, it was the slaves in the West Virginia Panhandle that he anticipated would join this insurrection. And that never really happened, and for a few reasons. One, word had gotten out in the countryside, in the weeks before. The other thing was, because of that, he had moved up his timetable. So even though there were reports of enslaved men with pikes and preparing for it, they didn't get the memo. So that was one thing. The other, and it's part of the historiography of Harper's Ferry, kind of tamps down the idea that the slaves were unhappy and that they were, they just didn't join his rebellion. But on the other side of the coin, when the jurors convicted Brown and Shields Green and John Anthony Copeland, all the jurors who were slaveholders their barns and their crops were torched. So that might have been the insurrection that didn't happen at the ferry. And so there are two views of that, of the slaves' reaction to his raid.
Gene, I want to thank you for your time this morning. Great stuff on the commemoration of John Brown's raid on what was then Harper's Ferry, Virginia. 5 for Freedom is the name of the book. Gene, thank you so much. Have a great day, sir.
Well, thank you. You do the same.
Take care.
See ya.
Yeah.
Gene Meyer. Colin has a picture of the book cover up on the screen right now. Thank you, Colin.